What's up, Net Impact? It is cheating. I know it's cheating to open up like with the president giving you the opening, but I can't help it. I can't help it. So we'll get back to My Brother's Keeper. I want to say thank you, Liz. Thank you, team, for giving me the opportunity to be here today with this room of incredible change makers and to share a little bit of my story with you, talk about what we're doing, and share some thoughts about how we can make history together. So let me start a little bit with my story. That's me and my mom, Kim. I think I was about 8 years old in that picture. And for you young black men, the high top started with us. If you could kind of see it, you know, that was my generation, the original Fresh Prince Kid and Play. I wanted it to be really, really tall, but my mother had limits, so that was about as tall as it ever got. And that gap, it closed by itself, never any braces. So, you know, you can see, oh, maybe you're not, there's that slide. So, my story, I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts. Any Massachusetts folks out here? Hey, Massachusetts. What? Springfield's in the house? So my mom was 16 years old when I was born. My dad had just turned 16 about a month before I was born. And I grew up in one of those neighborhoods now they'd probably call it a underserved community, majority minority community. We just called it a poor black neighborhood at the time. And it was one of those communities, like many of our cities, that, you know, my mother's generation in that community grew up. There were lots of great factory jobs. People could raise their family. But in the 1980s, the crack epidemic came in. A lot of those factory jobs went away. And it became a really, really rough neighborhood. Lots of crime, lots of violence, lots of folks trying to find their way through and finding it harder and harder, especially for someone who was a single teenage mom. I grew up in a neighborhood like that, but I tell you, I was given so much love in my life. One, my mother realized when she became a single teenage mom, she found religion. She wanted to kind of get on the right track, and we became Pentecostal. And so from the time I was about 1 year old, I was in church every minute the door was open. Anybody know the Pentecostal religion? We were in church like 7 days a week. There was young people meeting on Monday, there was choir rehearsal on Tuesday, Bible class on Wednesday, 3-day revival. So one, she made sure I was in church as much as I could be. Then she sent me to one of these busing programs. So I was in the METCO program in Massachusetts, where they take inner city kids and ship them off to the suburbs. That was a really interesting experience. I could write a book about what that's like. Can I touch your hair? Your hair feels like a Brillo pad. Do you guys have houses in your city? I'm talking about Springfield, Massachusetts, not New York. But it was an interesting experience. There was no crime, there was no violence, I was free to be me. The third thing that she did for me was she sent me to my Boys and Girls Club. She said, if I'm sending you to school out in the burbs, I want you to really be in touch and know your community. And so every minute I wasn't in school or I wasn't at church, I was at the Boys and Girls Club. And that was transformative to me. It created incredible pathways for me, and in many reasons, other than a whole lot of grace, it's probably why I'm standing here in front of you today. Let me tell you about my brother Tori. So my brother Tori, that's me and him. I guess that's pre-high top days. My brother and I have the same dad and different moms, but we literally grew up down the street from each other, probably about 3 or 4 blocks away from each other in Springfield. And, you know, although we were a few blocks away from each other, we still had all the brother moments, right? So we fought over the front seat, we fought over which VHS to watch, we fought over when he wanted to follow me around and say everything and repeat everything that I did. And so it was typical brother stuff. He was a precocious little kid. I remember one time he asked me, does Michael Jackson own the police? These were the kind of things that you asked in the 80s and 90s to your big brother. What's really interesting, though, is watching the paths that Tori and I took. So when I was about 14 and Tori was 11, I was starting high school, really trying to figure out who I was. And I found out later when Tori was 11, he got introduced to selling drugs by one of his cousins at 11 years old. I found that out when he was in his 20s. Fast forward a few years later, when I'm about 17 going off to college and Tori was about 14 years old, I started getting calls that Tori's in trouble, Tori's in juvie, Tori's not going to school. And I'm like, how is my kid little brother that I'm just playing with and fighting over the front seat getting into troubles like that? Fast forward 3 years later, I'm 20 years old, Tori's about 17 years old, Tori's been locked up for the first time. I'm still in college trying to figure out my way. Tori has his first child. And then if you know the path that happens there, Tori's in and out of jail, Tori has another kid, Tori ends up having to pay child support, gets his license taken away, can't make it to work, and you know that story. You get into a vicious cycle where you can't work your way out. I remember over the next few years getting calls at like 3 o'clock in the morning from Tori saying, I don't know how to get out of this situation. What do I want to do? And it's little things. Then, around one time I came home from the holidays and Tori told me he felt like he needed to start carrying a gun around. I'm like, a gun? Tori, in Springfield, Massachusetts, you have to carry a gun? And he told me about friends of his that were getting shot and killed in Springfield, Massachusetts. And I'm thinking, what is going on here? And fast forward a few years later, I'm about 30 years old. I had just been promoted to vice president at the Case Foundation, and I get a call from my father that I need to come home because Tori was shot and killed in the neighborhood that I grew up in. My little brother lived down the block from me, the little boy that we would fight over the front seat with. He left behind my niece, my 2 nephews, and a devastated family at another life that was senselessly and tragically lost. I see it every day when we go around. We turn off the TV, it becomes background noise when the 600th kid in Chicago this year was shot and killed. But that's someone's family. That's a mother's little boy. That's my little brother. And for so many reasons, that's why I do the work that I do. It charges me, it moves me forward. And for many reasons, that's why we started My Brother's Keeper. My Brother's Keeper has its root in the verdict in the Trayvon Martin case. You may remember the president came out and he surprised the press briefing corps after the verdict, trying to explain to America why we were so angry about another life senselessly lost. That's when he said 30 years ago, Trayvon Martin could have been me. Trayvon Martin could be my son. He said we have to do something to make sure young men of color in this country know that their country cares about them and is willing to invest in them. Fast forward about 6 months later, in the East Room of the White House where the Civil Rights Act was signed, the president, through presidential memorandum, created the My Brother's Keeper initiative, moving policy, moving state and local engagement, calling the private sector to action to make sure all young people in our communities know that their country cares about them and will create pathways for opportunity for them equally. I love this picture. It shows the president's commitment. The story behind this picture, we have a mentorship program at the White House, and the kids were there doing a resume writing workshop. And we knew that the president might drop by, and the president dropped by, and that young man to the president's, my right, said, Mr. President, when we first met you, you said maybe one day we could play basketball with you, that kind of kid. And he's like, okay, go see if the courts are ready. And that means make the courts ready. And so that's the president walking down to the basketball court to play horse with the young men in our mentorship and leadership program and giving some of the best kind of life talk that you could possibly imagine. So you guys know the challenges that boys and young men of color face from the time we are born, Black, Latino, tribal young men of color, growing up in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, having limited fathers that are in the home, reading at grade level, 80% of Black and Latino kids not reading at grade level. You go all the way up to homicide. Black boys, for instance, are 6% of the nation's population, but nearly half of the nation's murder victim. Actually, our President's Council on Economic Advisors put out a study last summer that showed if you are a Black baby boy born 25 years ago, anyone in that range, Black baby boy born 25 years ago? If you're a Black baby boy born 25 years ago in the United States of America, you have a 1 in 2 chance of being employed today. A 1 in 2 chance. That's due to early death, kids like my brother. That's due to over-incarceration or other inequities in education and employment. But let me tell you the flip side of that story. That same study shows if we could close the employment gap between young men of color between the ages of 16 and 54 and their peers, we would increase GDP by 2%. So if you hear the president talk about this, he will say we have a moral obligation to make sure that America remains a place where you make it if you try. But he would also say we have an economic imperative because America cannot remain globally competitive when we are just satisfied with writing off so many young men who are sitting on the sidelines. You know the impact that our economy depends on production, it depends on consumption, and we need all of our young people producing the next iPhones, producing the next Tesla, consuming at $50, $60, $70 an hour jobs. That is what is going to continue to keep America competitive. And that's what My Brother's Keeper is all about. So what have we done? You've seen incredible work. We now have 250 communities, including here in Philly, that have accepted the My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge. We've seen more than $1 billion in private sector support, and we have more than 80% of our policy recommendations that we gave the president 2 years ago complete and on track. And the policy recommendations that you see, they're not kumbaya conversations, they're not press release events. It's about getting to systemic strategic issues like Second Chance Pell. For the first time in 30 years, if you're incarcerated in some communities around the country, you can actually now get a Pell Grant so that you can get a college education while you're incarcerated and you can come out and be a productive member of society. So why does this matter to me? Why does this matter altogether? This is one of my favorite quotes from Einstein. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. You know we've become asleep in the work that we do in the pro-social sector. We have a school system that was based on what things were like 50, 75 years ago. We have a social sector based on what things were like 100 years ago, and we're seeing results not changing, except I know that this room is going to disrupt it. The other reason that this is important is because we've got to act with urgency. This is a serious quote. Dr. King reminded us that tomorrow is too late, and we want 12, 20-year studies. We've got to act right now because our kids are literally falling through the cracks and have guns staring them in the face. So let me offer you 3 things that I think you can do. The first thing that you can do if you want to make history is be fearless. When I was Senior Vice President at the Case Foundation, we launched a campaign called Be Fearless, which was really trying to have a conversation about how we can really take more risks, be bold in the social sector. Because if we can't, then who is? Why is it okay for an athlete, an entertainer, an entrepreneur to be fearless and we're incremental and slow? So what does it mean to be fearless? We commission research on the kind of common attributes in fearless change makers. One, they make big bets. People don't want to follow the incremental. They don't want 500 different things. They want a big call to action, like we're going to end malaria. We're going to have a play place in every walking distance to every kid. We're going to make sure every young man of color in these 10 communities has a job. So make a big bet for your work. The second thing they do is they constantly experiment. They figure out how to do R&D even when you don't have R&D money. They make failure matter. They don't kind of get lost and sad about failures. They learn from them and they build on top of them. They reach beyond the bubble, making sure that innovation happens at the intersection, and they let urgency conquer fear. They don't get stuck. The second thing you can do, and I have to draw this out, is be collaborative. You all know that the world that we're going into, if you want to make change, it's no longer just the private sector or the social sector or philanthropy or corporations. It's all happening together. I'll give you one small example. It's so interesting you gave the Palestinian example. I worked when I was at Case Foundation on the U.S.-Palestinian partnership. And so we worked with the Bush administration. We worked with the Palestinian government to try to promote educational and economic opportunity. Because if you want to partner in peace, you have to make sure people have hope and opportunity. So we did things like creating a venture capital fund. We brought in Boys and Girls Club to work with USDA to open youth development centers. We brought in Google to do developer days. You've got to figure out how to play to the strengths of each of the sectors coming together if you want breakthrough innovations. So don't try to go it alone. It is so much easier to go it alone. Trust me, for those of you who have done partnerships, you get that call like, why isn't my logo here? Can we wait another month to do this? If you want to go far, go together. The last thing I have to tell you is you've got to bet on the winners. We spend $300 billion a year in America on nonprofits, where 80% of them don't do any sort of research. More than 50% don't have a theory of change or logic model. So the pie's not getting bigger. Since the recession, the revenue that's going to nonprofits is flat or a little above at best. So until one of you invents, I don't know, teleportation and we have some big economic boom, the pie is not getting better. So one, we're going to have to bet on the winners, and two, we're going to have to come up with some creative social financing. So make sure we're judging outcomes, not outputs. Don't ask me how many kids went through the program. Tell me how many kids went to college, stayed in college, went on and got a job. We get really kind of okay in the nonprofit sector, patting ourselves on the back with one good story. But if we're going to have breakthroughs, we're going to have to focus on outcomes, and we're going to have to bring new dollars in the space. So when I was at the Social Innovation Fund, we launched our first Pay for Success. We're doing deal structuring. We're doing feasibility studies. We have innovation funds. We have microloans. You're going to have to figure out new ways to bring new income in and bet on the winners. And so I want to leave you with one thought. As you go and you think about making history, this is one of the quotes that I keep hanging up in my office. A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they shall never sit. A society grows great when old men plant trees in whose shade they know they shall never sit. I was sitting at the opening of the African American History Museum a few weeks ago, and I looked at folks like John Lewis, and I looked at the great civil rights leaders, and it made me think that so many of us are sitting under the shade and benefiting from the fruit of the trees that they planted a generation ago. And we're sitting there, and we've got no shovel, and we are not planning to plant the trees for the next generation. I heard John Lewis once say, you know, you young people thank me for allowing you to stand on my shoulders. I want you to get off my shoulders and get to work. So that's what this is all about. We're going to act with urgency, but we've got to realize that we need to get some shovels ready. We need to act with urgency. We need to be fearless. We need to be collaborative. We need to bet on the winners, and we need to plant the trees so our children and our children's children and their children's can benefit from the shade and the fruit for generations to come. Thank you so much, Net Impact.